Something stirs beneath the ice. Long before history began, another kind of human walked the frozen earth, strong, intelligent, and unyielding. They hunted mammoths across endless plains, carved symbols into stone, and guarded the flame that kept the darkness at bay. For over 300,000 years, they ruled the cold world between fire and frost. But the wind changed, the ice closed in, and their footsteps slowly vanished beneath the snow. Yet, not all was lost. In the warmth of every fire, in the quiet of every breath, something of them still remains, a trace of the Neanderthals, humanity's first mirror. Their story is not one of extinction, but of endurance, of love, of legacy carved in stone and carried in blood. So, take a moment, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you're listening from tonight. Let's see how far their memory still reaches, as we return to that ancient world of ice and fire. This is Life and Death of a Neanderthal. The wind moves like a ghost across the valley, carrying the sound of snowflakes as they strike the frozen earth. The air is heavy with silence, a kind of stillness that feels older than time itself. Beneath a jagged ridge of ice and stone, a fire burns low, its light flickering against the walls of a shallow cave. This is the heart of the last Neanderthal winter. The land around him is unrecognizable. Once green valleys lie buried beneath endless drifts. The rivers that once ran through them have turned to glass. Herds of bison and mammoth that once thundered across the plains have vanished toward warmer horizons. What remains are only the echoes of their passage. Hoofprints frozen in the crust of snow, the scattered bones of what the cold did not forgive. Here, survival has become a ritual measured by embers and breath. Each spark struck from flint carries the weight of generations who lived and died by the flame. The Neanderthals have known this land for over 200,000 years, shaping their lives around its rhythm of ice and thaw. Their bodies are built for this world, broad-chested, strong-limbed, faces sculpted to withstand the wind. But even strength has its limits. The ice grows bolder each year, pressing southward, swallowing forests and plains alike. Within these frozen valleys, the boundaries of endurance are closing in. The hunt grows longer, the nights stretch beyond reckoning. Hunger gnaws like another kind of predator, one that cannot be outrun. Fires burn smaller now, not from neglect, but from scarcity. The world that once fed them now demands payment in patience and pain. In the quiet of this endless winter, time itself begins to lose meaning. The stars appear sharper in the sky, burning through the frozen haze, the same constellations that guided their ancestors. Each glittering point of light is a memory, a mark of the world before the cold took hold. And yet, even as the land hardens, there remains a calm acceptance in their way of life. There is no panic here, only persistence. In this final age of ice, the Neanderthals do not vanish in battle or calamity. They fade like the last smoke of a dying fire, slowly, quietly, beautifully. The snow keeps falling, soft and endless, burying the footprints of a people who once ruled the cold. And when the wind rises again, the valley seems to breathe a sigh from a world remembering the last of its children. Long before the last winter settled over the world, before the valleys froze and the rivers turned to glass, a different age of the earth gave birth to a different kind of human. It was a colder, harsher world than ours, a place where survival demanded more than strength, it demanded transformation. From the shifting ice and the forests that whispered with wolves, the Neanderthals emerged. They were not mistakes of evolution, nor primitive shadows of what would come later. They were the rightful children of Europe's deep time. For nearly 500,000 years, their lives unfolded against a backdrop of glaciers that advanced and retreated like slow-breathing giants. In this land of endless winter, they became sculptors of survival, molded by wind, hunger, and endurance. The first signs of their kind appeared in caves and riverbeds now buried beneath the soil. Bones thick and heavy, skulls wide and low, hands strong enough to shatter stone. These early people learned to read the world in ways modern eyes have long forgotten. They knew how the light shifted before a storm, how the air changed when herds moved through the valley. They understood that fire was not only warmth, but memory, a force to be protected like kin. Every generation learned from the land. Flint became an extension of the hand, sharpened into blades that could skin, carve, and craft. Stones carried knowledge. Fire carried hope. Theirs was a slow, patient intelligence, built from repetition, trial, and memory passed wordlessly from one season to the next. They built shelters from bone and hide, shaped by wind and will. They followed the rhythm of the hunt, moving with the herds, resting where water still ran beneath the ice. Over time, the earth itself bore their signature. Campsites buried beneath layers of ash and sediment mark where fires once burned bright. Charred bones, broken tools, and footprints hardened in clay tell the story of beings who refused to surrender to extinction's shadow. They became masters of the cold, not by conquering it, but by learning its every secret. And yet, beneath their strength, there was something more, an early sense of belonging, of connection between life and death, between the hunter and the hunted. Each kill was a conversation with nature, each fire a covenant with time. In the roar of the wind and the silence that followed, the Neanderthals stood as part of the earth itself. They were born of stone and storm, forged in a world that tested every heartbeat. And for more than 200,000 years, they endured not as relics, but as the earth's greatest survivors. The world of the Neanderthal was carved from cold and silence. Across the frozen plains and stony hills, the wind ruled like a restless spirit, sweeping through valleys and biting through flesh and fur alike. In that unforgiving world, survival meant more than the hunt, it meant the mastery of warmth. This was where they began to shape the spaces that would cradle their existence. The first shelters were not monuments of architecture but quiet triumphs of endurance, born from bone, hide, and the stubborn will to live another night. The caves of Europe became their sanctuaries. Some were vast hollows carved by ancient rivers, others small openings tucked into limestone cliffs. Each offered a fragile promise, protection from the wind, from the predators that prowled beyond the firelight, from the endless cold that clawed at their sleep. Within these stone chambers they began to build the world's first true homes. Fires glowed against the walls, painting the rock with shifting light. The scent of smoke, ash, and animal fat clung to the air, a perfume of persistence. Around the fire, order began to take shape. Stones ringed the hearths, hides softened the ground, and bones were repurposed into tools, supports, and frames. Every placement had meaning. Every object carried the mark of use and care. Here, warmth became more than comfort, it became culture. The flicker of flame against the stone was more than survival. It was art, a living rhythm that danced and breathed with them. The fire's glow was their heartbeat in the dark. In these shelters, generations found continuity. Children grew where their mothers once gathered furs, where their fathers repaired spears. The same walls that echoed with one winter's whispers would bear witness to another. The caves were not simply shelters. They were memory made physical, layered with the smoke of centuries. Outside, the world remained merciless. Storms howled, the rivers froze, and the animals roamed in wary silence. But within those firelit spaces, humanity took its first steps toward something enduring. Warmth gave them time, and time gave them imagination. Around the coals, minds began to wander. Patterns in the flames mirrored patterns in thought. From fire came story. From shelter came belonging. In that glow, the Neanderthal learned the oldest lesson of all, that survival is not only the struggle to stay alive but the art of creating a place where life can be remembered. The first shelters were more than walls against the cold, they were the beginning of home. Across the endless whiteness of the Ice Age plains, life and death moved together like shadows in the snow. Each breath drawn by a Neanderthal was part of an ancient rhythm, one that pulsed through the veins of hunter and hunted alike. Theirs was a world without mercy, where hunger sculpted both body and mind, and where survival became a daily conversation between flesh and flame. The hunt began long before the chase. It started with silence, with observation, with patience carved by necessity. From high ridges, They watched the movements of mammoths and reindeer, herds dark against the pale horizon. Every muscle, every heartbeat, was tuned to the land. The snow told stories if one knew how to listen. The deep prints of hooves, the drag of a wounded leg, the faint warmth rising from breath in the morning frost. When the time came, they moved as one. Coordination was not commanded but felt, born from generations of practice. Spears tipped with flint, hands wrapped in hide, eyes fixed on the pulse of the herd. The moment of the strike was swift and brutal. A spear arced through the frozen air, guided by instinct and precision. The impact broke the silence like thunder. The earth shook as the great mammoth fell. Steam rose from its body, curling upward in ghostly ribbons against the cold. Blood ran over the snow, staining it crimson, a stark reminder that every victory carried a cost. Around the fallen beast, the hunters worked with quiet purpose. Blades carved through hide and sinew, dividing the bounty of life into portions that would feed the living. Every piece was used: the bones for tools, the hide for shelter, the tendons for binding. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be. Back at their shelters, the fire waited like an ancient ally. Over its heat, meat crackled and fat dripped, the scent of sustenance filling the cave. Fire was their second weapon, their silent companion in the long war against cold and hunger. Its light painted the walls with shifting amber, reflecting the story of their triumphs. Here, around the flames, they honored the exchange between life and death, the animal's sacrifice, their endurance, the unbroken chain of survival. This was their rhythm, the eternal balance between pursuit and flame, between hunger and warmth. Theirs was not a life of cruelty, but of necessity. Every act of killing was an act of reverence, a reaffirmation of belonging to a world that gave only to those who learned to take with respect. In that endless winter, blood and fire bound them to the earth, and in that bond lay the essence of what it meant to be alive. In the stillness of the ancient plains, a community breathes as one. Around the firelight, faces glow in shades of amber and shadow. These are the faces of a people bound by blood, by memory, by the quiet strength of belonging. Each expression tells a story without words, a shared language of gesture, touch, and gaze that carries more meaning than any sound ever could. Within the clan, life unfolds in simple but sacred cycles. The hunters return from the hunt, their shoulders marked by cold and labor. The mothers tend the fire, shaping the rhythm of life within its light. The children, small and wide-eyed, study everything in silence. They learn by watching the flick of a hand, the angle of a spear, the way their elders read the world by scent and sound. Knowledge is not taught through speech but absorbed through closeness, as if the wisdom of generations flows invisibly from one body to another. In this world, language is not yet a storm of words. It is built from breath, from small sounds that rise from the throat, from the tilt of the head, or the lift of an eyebrow. It is the way a mother hums softly as she wraps her child in hide, the way a hunter signals danger with a glance, the way laughter flickers in the eyes even in the heart of winter. These are the first true conversations of humanity spoken through care, through connection, through shared survival. Their lives are woven from cooperation. The old and the young, the strong and the weak, all play their part in the fragile balance of existence. Food is shared with intention, tools are passed between hands like heirlooms of endurance. The bonds between them are not of convenience but of need, for in this world, isolation is death. Together, they form something greater than survival: community. At night, as the firelight trembles against the stone walls, the faces of the clan glow like a constellation brought to earth. Their features are broad and powerful, yet gentle in expression, foreheads high, brows strong, eyes deep and thoughtful. In those eyes lies the quiet intelligence of a people who understood that strength alone was never enough. For the Neanderthals, love was not spoken but lived. It was the hand steadying another through pain, the shared warmth of bodies through the coldest nights, the silent promise that tomorrow would be faced together. These gestures, small and wordless, were the beginning of what it means to be human. And though time would one day erase their names, the echo of their care still lingers in every fire built for warmth, in every touch given without need for words. Night descends upon the ancient world, slow and heavy. Beyond the mouth of the cave, the plains fade into darkness, and the wind hums low across the ice. Inside, the air glows with the pulse of fire. Shadows dance along the stone walls, flickering in rhythm with the flames, bending and breathing like living spirits. Here, in the heart of the Ice Age, the Neanderthals begin to do something extraordinary. For the first time, they reach beyond survival. They begin to remember. With fingers blackened by ash and ochre, they touch the rock, tracing outlines of what their minds already see. The walls become a canvas for thought, for story, for presence. A hand pressed against stone becomes a declaration of existence, a silent statement that says, "I was here." The animals they knew so well, the mammoth, the deer, the bison, take shape in pigments drawn from earth and blood. Their forms flicker in the firelight, half real, half ghost, as though the creatures themselves have returned for one last breath. These markings are not decoration. They are communication with something beyond themselves, a bridge between life and memory. Each stroke carries the weight of observation and reverence. To paint the mammoth is to honor it, to keep its spirit close after the hunt, to ensure that its essence remains within the safety of the cave. The line between the seen and the unseen begins to blur. In this act, thought becomes permanent. For the first time, an idea survives longer than its maker. The cave walls hold their minds, their stories, their fears. The flicker of fire gives the drawings movement, transforming still images into living motion. The people who sit before these glowing walls are witnessing the birth of imagination itself. The cave is not just shelter now, it is memory made visible. The fires that once warded off darkness now summon light within it. Around these flames, the Neanderthals have become more than hunters and survivors. They are storytellers, dreamers, makers of shadows. The act of creation becomes their quiet defiance against the vastness of time. Outside, the wind continues its endless journey across the frozen plains, but within these stone chambers, a new kind of life has begun, one that exists in color and symbol, in gesture and light. These early artists do not know it, but they have given humanity its first language of eternity. Long after the fire fades, their marks will remain, still whispering through the ages, telling the world that once, in the heart of the ice, someone dreamed. In the frozen heart of the Pleistocene, the hunt is not just survival, it is ceremony. Every chase begins with patience and ends with reverence. Across the open plains where wind carves the snow into rippling dunes, a small band of Neanderthals moves in unspoken unity. Their world offers no guarantees, no abundance, only the constant negotiation between hunger and endurance. When a hunt succeeds, it is not taken for granted. It is a gift, one drawn from the earth itself. The body of the animal lies heavy against the snow, steam rising from its wounds in pale ribbons. Around it, the hunters work with precision and purpose. Flint blades slice through sinew and hide, guided by muscle memory older than speech. The sound of cracking bone fills the air, rhythmic and deliberate, as marrow is freed from its shell, a hidden treasure of fat and warmth. Each movement is efficient, each gesture shaped by generations of repetition. Nothing is wasted. The hide will become shelter, the bones will become tools, the tendons will bind, and the meat will nourish. This act is more than labor. It is communion. The hunters understand the weight of what has been taken. They have learned that life exists only through exchange, that strength must pass from one body to another. Around the carcass there is no celebration, no loud victory, only quiet gratitude. The air is filled with the scent of blood and smoke, a reminder that every breath drawn by the living carries the memory of the dead. Back at their shelter, fire brings the feast to life. The meat roasts slowly, its fat hissing against the flames. Sparks rise like brief constellations, fading into the darkness above. The hunters sit in a circle, passing food hand to hand, portioning it according to need, not desire. The young eat first, then the mothers, then the rest. This ritual of fairness is not taught, it is instinctive, born from a truth they all understand: the clan survives only as one. As the night deepens, warmth spreads through the cave. The fire's glow softens faces hardened by cold and labor. The bones, now cleaned and hollow, rest near the hearth, waiting to be shaped into tools that will hunt again. In this cycle of life and death, nothing ends, only continues. For the Neanderthals, the hunt is more than the pursuit of prey, it is the thread that ties them to the world. Through it, they find purpose, structure, and meaning. The silence that follows a successful kill is not emptiness. It is reverence. It is understanding. It is the quiet heartbeat of a people who knew that to live was to take, to share, and to give back. The sky was a vast and living map, and for the Neanderthal, it was both mystery and memory. Each night, when the wind fell silent and the fire sank into embers, their eyes lifted toward the cold brilliance above. The stars, scattered like shards of flint across the heavens, spoke of order in a world of chaos. They were not yet gods, not yet worshipped, but they were guides, familiar patterns that whispered of the seasons, of migration, of change. The elder, wrapped in furs stiffened by frost, would watch the constellations shift over the horizon. He knew their rhythm, though he could not name it. The long bright path of winter told when the herds would move, when the rivers would freeze, when the air would turn cruel. The sky became a clock long before time was counted. Its movements shaped the pulse of life below. For the Neanderthals, this understanding was not science, nor faith. It was instinct, born from endless observation. The color of the dawn, the scent of the air, the silence before a storm, all were messages written in nature's script. When clouds gathered low and heavy, they knew the snow would come thick and fast. When the moon rose pale and thin, they felt the deep cold that would follow. Their senses extended beyond sight, attuned to subtleties modern minds have long forgotten. The sky's changes were their language of survival. The great lights that burned above were reminders that nothing was random, that the earth's hardships followed patterns as old as fire itself. In those endless winters, the Neanderthals became students of the world, reading it not through words but through awareness. The heavens were their teacher, patient and eternal. At times, the stars must have stirred something deeper than understanding. The steady turning of the constellations mirrored the rhythm of their own lives: birth, growth, hunger, death, and the quiet renewal of another dawn. The same stars that glimmered over a successful hunt shone again over loss and burial. Perhaps, as they gazed upward, they recognized a reflection of themselves, small and fragile beneath an infinite sky. Their nights were long, their fires brief, but above them the universe kept its ancient order. The Neanderthals could not write their wisdom, but they lived it in every decision, every journey, every look toward the heavens. To them, the sky was not distant, it was a part of life, a silent companion watching over their struggle and endurance. And in that watchfulness, they found direction, comfort, and meaning, a reminder that even in the coldest age, the world was never truly empty. In a world ruled by cold and struggle, compassion might seem a fragile thing. Yet deep in the shadowed caves of the Ice Age, beneath the weight of wind and snow, it found its first breath. A broken body could have meant death, but among the Neanderthals, survival was not always solitary. It was shared. It was carried. It was cared for. Archaeologists uncover this truth not through words or tools, but through bone. In the remains of a single jaw, worn and scarred, a story of kindness emerges. Teeth ground down to the root, infections healed over time, injuries that could not have mended without the help of others. The evidence is quiet but undeniable. The Neanderthals did not abandon their wounded. They stayed. They nursed. They waited. Imagine the burden of that choice. Every piece of food given to the injured meant less for the healthy. Every hour spent tending a wound meant another hour the fire might die. Yet they did it anyway. This was not instinct alone. It was recognition, a deep understanding that life depended not just on strength, but on connection. Theirs was a community bound not only by blood, but by empathy. The wounded hunter, limping and weakened, would have returned from the hunt or the fall, his body bruised, his spirit dimmed. In the harsh cold, infection would spread swiftly. But in these ancient shelters, care was not foreign. Hands that once struck flint now placed hides beneath his head. Water was warmed with glowing stones, food chewed soft for the injured to swallow. Around the fire, life was extended by gentleness. This compassion did not arise from comfort or excess. It was born from necessity and awareness, a realization that survival was a collective effort. In the Neanderthal world, every life held weight. The old taught the young how to find stone and spark. The mothers watched the skies. The hunters provided for all. And when one faltered, others bore the cost. That was the rhythm of their existence, the fragile web that held them together against the vast, uncaring cold. Their care extended even to death. Burials discovered across ancient Europe and the Near East revealed deliberate placement, protective covering, sometimes even flowers or tools left beside the dead. To tend the fallen was to honor the living. It was an acknowledgement that memory mattered, that bonds did not end when breath did. This instinct for compassion marks a turning point in the story of humanity. Long before language carried the weight of love, long before civilization named it virtue, it lived in gestures, a hand supporting another, a fire tended for someone too weak to move. In those moments, the Neanderthal stepped beyond the boundaries of survival. They began to live not just as individuals, but as a people. The broken tooth tells more than pain. It tells endurance through empathy, resilience through care. It speaks of a time when the first sparks of humanity glowed not in the tools or the hunts, but in the quiet moments beside the fire, when one life was sustained by the kindness of another. Beneath the ice and silence of their world, the Neanderthals carried something eternal, the ability to feel, to comfort, and to understand that strength was never meant to stand alone. The world was beginning to tighten its grip. The sky dimmed, the winds sharpened, and the earth itself seemed to turn against its children. The great warmth that once lingered between the seasons was gone, replaced by an age of relentless cold. The Ice Age was reaching its height, and with it came the slow unraveling of the Neanderthal world. Snow fell earlier each year, blanketing the valleys before the leaves had time to fall. Rivers froze thick and hard, locking away the lifeblood of the plains. The herds that had once fed countless generations, mammoth, bison, reindeer, moved farther and farther away, chasing the shrinking edges of grass and sunlight. Each migration left silence in its wake, a silence broken only by the wind sweeping through abandoned trails. In the caves and shelters of Europe, the fires burned longer, but their warmth no longer reached as far. The people huddled close, feeding the flames with the last scraps of wood gathered from frozen forests. The smoke hung heavy in the air, darkening the ceilings of their homes, staining the memory of their endurance into the stone. Outside, the world howled. Inside, the world waited. The children cried softly in the night, their breaths shallow, their small hands pressed against their mothers for warmth. Hunger had become a constant companion. The once rich stores of dried meat and marrow bones dwindled. Every hunt grew harder, every step more perilous. The cold was not a passing season, it was a tide, and it was rising. The Neanderthals knew this pattern. They had weathered the great freezes before. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had adapted, shifting with the rhythms of a changing earth. But this time was different. The glaciers were moving faster, the winters stretching longer, the summers too brief to heal the land. The balance that had sustained them was faltering. In this endless cold, survival demanded more than strength. It demanded memory, resilience, and faith in the fire's light. They wrapped themselves in furs and hope, walking the frozen plains in search of food that no longer came. Each step through the snow was heavier than the last, yet still they moved, guided by the instinct that had carried their kind through ages of struggle. The world around them was changing in ways they could not see. The forests were retreating south. New creatures roamed beyond the horizon. The familiar rhythms of the past, the migrations, the hunts, the seasons were slipping out of reach. For the Neanderthals, this was more than cold. It was erasure. And yet, even as the cold closed in, they did not yield easily. They kept their fires burning, guarded them like hearts made of flame. In the face of a world turning to ice, they refused to vanish quietly. Each spark struck in the darkness was a declaration, a promise that they would endure, even as the sky grew pale and the earth itself seemed to forget the warmth of its own sun. Across the vast white wilderness, small bands of Neanderthals move in silence. The land around them is frozen to its bones, a world locked in winter without end. They travel across rivers turned to glass, their reflections faint against the ice. Each footprint left behind is a story that will vanish by morning, swallowed by drifting snow. In this age, movement is survival. To stay still is to die. The landscape stretches endlessly, rolling tundra, skeletal trees, hills of glittering frost. The air is thin and sharp, carrying the scent of stone and distance. The travelers know no borders. They follow the trails of the reindeer, the mammoth, and the great steppe bison, reading the faint signs that others would overlook. The tilt of grass beneath the snow, the echo of hoofbeats days old, the faint warmth of dung turned to ice. To them, the frozen earth is not empty but alive with direction. They move in small groups, rarely more than a dozen. Too many mouths mean starvation. Too few, and the dangers multiply. Each member holds knowledge that the others rely upon: how to strike a spark when the wind devours flame, how to find water beneath the crusted ice, how to follow the stars when the landmarks disappear beneath snow. This is not aimless wandering. It is a pilgrimage through memory, retracing the ancient paths their ancestors once walked when the world was still kind. Nights are cruel. The fires burn low, and the cold seeps into bone. They wrap themselves in furs stiffened by frost, forming circles of warmth around embers that barely glow. The sound of wind becomes a lullaby, a constant reminder that they are small beneath a sky without mercy. Yet, in that smallness, there is a kind of grace, a quiet understanding that they belong to this world, even as it tries to erase them. When morning comes, the horizon is pale and endless. The light shimmers against the snow, blinding and pure. They rise and move again, their footprints stringing across the valley like a fragile thread connecting one day to the next. The rhythm of travel becomes the rhythm of existence. Every hill climbed, every frozen river crossed, is another testament to their endurance. In these wandering lives, the Neanderthals carry everything that matters: their tools, their firestones, their memory of roots carved by generations before them. They leave little behind but the faint impressions of their passing stone flakes, a hearth buried in frost, a single tooth lost in the snow. Time will cover it all, but the earth will remember. They do not travel for conquest or discovery. They travel because the world demands it. The ice moves like a living thing, reshaping their boundaries, pushing them onward. To stop is to surrender. So they keep moving, guided by hunger, by instinct, and by the quiet hope that somewhere beyond the white horizon, the world might soften again. Each step across the frozen land is a prayer written in footprints. A prayer for warmth, for food, for tomorrow. And though the snow will erase their trail, the echo of their passage endures in the stone tools left behind, in the ancient bones that tell their story, and in the unbroken will that defines what it means to be human. In a world where life was brief and the cold unrelenting, death was never far. It moved quietly among the Neanderthals, not as an enemy, but as a companion. Across the valleys of ice and stone, it waited in the shadows of caves, followed their migrations, and slept where they slept. To live in such a world meant knowing loss, yet in that knowing, they discovered something extraordinary. They learned to remember. On a rise overlooking the plains, a mound of earth breaks the monotony of snow. Beneath it lies the story of care written in bones. Here, the Neanderthals did something that changed the meaning of existence. They buried their dead. It was not a gesture of instinct or fear, but one of reverence. The fallen were not left for scavengers or storms. They were placed carefully within the earth, surrounded by stones, animal bones, and sometimes even wildflowers gathered from the tundra. The act of burial reveals more than compassion. It reveals awareness, a recognition of finality, of the divide between breath and silence. The body, once strong and familiar, became sacred in stillness. The living understood that to honor it was to preserve its place within the clan. Death was no longer disappearance. It became continuity, a thread connecting the living to those who came before. In the soft light of the caves, the evidence remains. Skeletons found curled as if in sleep, faces turned toward the warmth of a remembered fire. Around them, traces of ochre pigment and pollen linger in the soil, proof that someone had knelt there, arranging the grave with deliberate hands. The placement of stones at the head and feet was not random. It was order, intention, meaning. To the Neanderthals, these rituals may have carried no spoken prayers, no myths of heaven or underworld. But their gestures spoke the same language that all humans would one day inherit: the need to remember, to hold on to what time tries to erase. In this world of fleeting life, the act of burial transformed death from an ending into a form of memory. The Hill of Bones, as we imagine it now, was not a place of fear. It was a place of return. The hunters and mothers who gathered there understood that the body before them had once shared the same fire, the same hunger, the same cold. To lay it in the ground was to acknowledge that bond, to give something back to the earth that had sustained them. Even in their harsh reality, they found beauty in farewell. Perhaps it was the scent of crushed flowers mingling with frost, or the sound of wind sweeping gently over the mound. These small rituals, born of love and necessity, mark one of the first moments when humanity looked beyond survival and toward meaning. In the quiet that follows the burial, the firelight flickers across the faces of the living. They will rise and walk again into the snow, carrying with them the weight of memory. For in honoring their dead, the Neanderthals did something profoundly human. They ensured that no one was ever truly lost. Beneath the ice, beneath the soil, beneath the turning of the ages, the echo of their care endures. In the age of endless winter, fire was more than warmth, it was life itself. Every ember held the memory of survival, the fragile thread that bound a people to the world around them. When storms swept down from the mountains and the wind howled through the valleys, there were always some who stayed behind to guard that light. Among them was one figure, a keeper of flame, whose silent duty carried the weight of generations. The storm had no mercy. It tore through the forests and scoured the plains, turning air into ice. The snow came sideways, thick and blinding, sealing the mouths of caves and burying the paths that led between them. Yet within the narrow shelter of stone, a small fire burned, weak but stubborn. The woman who kept it alive knew that its glow was the difference between life and oblivion. Her task was not heroic in the way of hunters or warriors, yet it was sacred. The fire was not hers alone. It belonged to all who would return when the storm passed. Firekeeping was an inheritance as old as humanity itself. The knowledge of how to coax flame from stone and spark was passed from hand to hand, never written, never forgotten. The fire was not a tool but a companion. It spoke in crackles and sighs. It breathed and consumed. It danced and retreated. To those who lived by it, the fire was alive, a living spirit bound by care. The woman fed it carefully, one piece of wood at a time, listening to its rhythm. Too much fuel, and it would smother. Outside, the world roared, erasing sound and shape. Inside, the air shimmered orange, turning the stone walls into a cave of light. The fire reflected in the woman's eyes, twin sparks mirroring the one before her. This moment was not unique. Across thousands of years and countless generations, others like her had done the same, waiting, tending, guarding the one force that turned darkness into safety. The act of keeping fire was an act of faith. It was belief in tomorrow, in the return of her people, in the persistence of warmth against a world built from cold. Every flicker she saved meant food could be cooked, tools could be forged, children could be born into light rather than shadow. It was the quiet power of care, the same care that once buried the dead, that once shared meat and marrow, now transformed into the stewardship of flame. When the storm finally began to fade, the silence returned, deep and heavy. The fire still burned, smaller now but alive, defiant. In its glow, the woman's face softened. She had done what generations before her had done, carried light through darkness. The story of the firekeeper is not about one woman alone. It is the story of every human who ever sat beside a flame and understood its meaning. In the heart of the Ice Age, surrounded by a world of frost and hunger, the Neanderthals found something eternal in that fragile glow. Fire was their teacher, their companion, their proof that warmth could exist even in a universe made of ice. And as long as someone stayed to guard it, humanity would never truly be extinguished. The snow remembers everything. Every step taken across the frozen earth leaves a trace, a fleeting imprint before wind and time erase it. One morning, long before the world had names for its species, a new set of footprints appeared near a Neanderthal camp. They were small, narrow, and light too delicate for the people who lived there, too precise for any known creature of the plains. The marks led across the frost and vanished into the mist, but they changed everything. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals were not alone. The world was beginning to shift. The ice still ruled, but beyond the mountains and deserts of Africa, another kind of human had begun to move. They were wanderers like the Neanderthals, hunters shaped by sun and sand instead of snow and stone. When they crossed into Europe, they stepped into a world already claimed, a world of fire, art, and memory. What followed was not a war, but an intersection, a moment when two branches of humanity briefly touched. The evidence of this meeting lives quietly in the earth. Archaeologists find it in the shared tools buried in caves, in hearths built side by side, in the mingling of stone flakes shaped by different hands. These traces speak of curiosity rather than conquest. The newcomers brought with them new techniques, sharper blades, new ways of binding hides, and perhaps even new ways of seeing. The Neanderthals, masters of the cold, carried knowledge of survival that had no equal. Between them, there was an exchange of skill, of habit, and perhaps of something far more intimate. The arrival of these strangers would have been subtle at first, a flicker of movement at the edge of vision, a trail of smoke seen across a distant ridge, the scent of cooking unfamiliar in the wind. For a species so attuned to its environment, even the smallest change would have stirred awareness. The Neanderthals had lived for millennia without rivals. Now, the earth carried another kind of mind. In the quiet places of the landscape, where the snow settled deep and the light lingered long, both kinds of humans must have studied each other from afar. They shared the same needs, the same hunger, the same fears, the same fragile hopes. The differences between them were real, yet small. The newcomers were leaner, more agile, their tools finer, their movements quicker. The Neanderthals were stronger, slower, bound by the rhythm of endurance. But beneath the fur and bone and ice, the same fire burned. The story of the stranger's print is the story of a threshold, the moment before recognition. For a brief time, the world held two kinds of humanity, each unaware of what the other would mean. In that shared landscape of ice and flame, one species stood at dusk, and another approached at dawn. The snow preserved the proof, two sets of footprints crossing paths and parting again. Soon, those prints would be swept away, but the meeting they marked would ripple through time. The Neanderthals, shaped by cold and patience, and the newcomers, driven by movement and adaptation, would walk together for a moment before the wind divided their trails. The earth would forget the details, but not the echo. In the end, the snow would melt, the bones would settle, and only the faint impression of that encounter would remain, a whisper of recognition between distant kin, carried through the ages by memory written in frost. The first light of morning crept slowly across the frozen valley, painting the snow in shades of gray and gold. Mist clung to the ground, rising from the river like a breath from the sleeping earth. In that pale silence, two kinds of humans stood within sight of one another, descendants of different worlds, shaped by the same instinct to endure. The Neanderthals, forged in the cold heart of Europe, and the newcomers, modern humans, travelers from the warmth of distant lands. For one fragile moment, their worlds overlapped. It was not a meeting of words or weapons. There was no battle cry, no shout of warning, only stillness. Across the fog, one pair of eyes met another. Recognition passed between them, quiet and wordless. They were not the same, but neither were they strangers in spirit. The air between them was filled with understanding older than language, the knowledge that both had fought the same hunger, feared the same cold, and built the same fires to hold back the dark. This moment, imagined through fragments of evidence, marks one of the rarest intersections in human history. The archaeological record tells its story in subtle ways. Layers of hearth ash shared in the same cave, tools of different styles lying side by side, bones of both species scattered within a single horizon of time. These clues suggest contact not born of conflict but of proximity, of coexistence. Perhaps they hunted the same herds, drank from the same rivers, sheltered in the same valleys when storms closed the sky. The Neanderthals would have seen in these strangers something both familiar and unsettling. The newcomers moved with a different rhythm, leaner, faster, their faces narrower, their voices carrying farther through the wind. Their tools were delicate but efficient, their gestures purposeful. To the Neanderthal eye, they may have seemed fragile, yet there was an intensity in their movements, a restlessness that spoke of distance traveled and lands unknown. For the newcomers, the encounter would have been just as profound. Here stood beings who mirrored them in form but not in presence. The Neanderthals were broader, their features heavy with the strength of adaptation. Their eyes were deep and steady, their movements measured. They were not beasts of myth or monsters of fear, they were kin. The shared silence between them was perhaps the oldest kind of conversation, carried not by voice but by gaze and understanding. When the fog thickened and the moment faded, both groups turned away. The Neanderthals back to the familiar shelter of their valleys, the newcomers onward into the unknown. No one could have known that this quiet exchange would echo across millennia, that from this shared dawn, one lineage would endure and another would fade. But for that brief morning, under a sky brushed with ice and light, the world held two forms of humanity standing side by side. The snow soon covered their footprints, erasing the path between them, but the memory of that encounter remained etched in the earth, and, in time, in us. It was not a meeting of conquest or fear, but of reflection, a moment when humanity looked into its own mirror and saw its twin. For an instant, before the winds of extinction began their slow whisper, the two species stood together at the edge of history, bound by the same dawn, the same breath, the same fragile spark of life. The earth had grown weary. The warmth that once lingered in spring no longer returned. Each year, the snow came sooner, stayed longer, and melted slower, until the seasons blurred into a single, endless winter. Across the frozen plains, the Neanderthals endured as they always had, with strength, patience, and the quiet determination of survival. But even endurance has its limits. The world was changing faster than their bodies and traditions could adapt, and hunger was becoming a constant presence, an invisible predator that stalked them day and night. The herds were fewer now. The mammoth, once abundant and slow-moving, had migrated far south, where the grass still grew. The reindeer followed, and the great bison that once thundered across the valleys vanished into the distance. What remained were the small, elusive creatures, hares, foxes, birds, and even they grew scarce as the cold deepened. Each hunt became longer, more desperate. The footprints of the hunters stretched for miles, and sometimes they returned empty-handed. In the caves, the fires burned low. Mothers shared their food with the children, taking only what was left after the young had eaten. The old gave up their portions without protest, their bodies already worn by years of toil and cold. Bones began to show through skin. The strong shoulders that once carried the weight of hunts and shelters grew thinner, the hands that shaped tools trembling from weakness. Hunger carved itself into the body as surely as the cold shaped the land. Even in the silence of survival, something beautiful endured the instinct to care. In the face of scarcity, compassion did not vanish. The Neanderthals shared what little they had, dividing meat, warming one another in the night, watching over the sick and old. Theirs was not a world of cruelty but of sacrifice. It was this sense of belonging, this thread of empathy, that had carried them through thousands of winters. Now, it was all that held them together. Songs, once sung softly by the fireside, grew fewer. Their music had always been simple, low hums that echoed like wind in a cave, rhythms that mirrored the heartbeat of the earth. These songs were not for celebration but remembrance, a way of keeping memory alive when words were not yet language. As hunger deepened, those songs faded, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the sound of the wind. Silence became their prayer. Archaeologists uncover this moment of struggle in the bones they left behind. Thinner, more fragile, marked by signs of malnutrition. In some sites, the remains of small animals and roots speak of desperate diets, of people turning to whatever the earth would yield. Yet even here, traces of care appear. Fires kept burning, shelters maintained, burials continued. They did not surrender to despair. They fought with the only weapons they had: each other and hope. The winters would continue to harden until the very land itself turned against them. But before they vanished, the Neanderthals left behind something greater than stone or bone. They left the story of persistence, of compassion in the face of hunger, of hands that still reached for one another even when the world was closing in. They were hunger's children, shaped by scarcity but defined by care. And though their voices would one day fall silent, the echo of their endurance remains in us, in every spark of empathy, in every shared breath against the cold. Deep within the mountains, where the wind cannot reach and the light of day fades to gray, lies a cavern alive with the breath of smoke. Its walls are blackened by centuries of fire, its ceiling low and heavy with soot. Here, at the edge of extinction, the Neanderthals gathered one final time. Outside, the world had turned to ice. The storm raged endlessly, filling valleys with snow and silence. Inside the cave, the air shimmered with heat and memory. The fire was their last defense against the cold, and around it, the last families of a great lineage shared what remained of their world. The cavern had always been a place of refuge. Generations before had slept here, hunted from here, and left their marks upon its stone. The walls were alive with the stories of the past, carvings of animals, handprints pressed into mineral dust, faint traces of ochre that time had not yet erased. These were not decorations. They were anchors, reminders of who they were and what they had endured. The flickering light of the fire made the carvings move, as if the old spirits of the hunt still danced upon the walls. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of roasting meat, though the portions were small, the food scarce. The Neanderthals had learned to stretch what little they had. The last mammoth bones had long since been cracked open for marrow. Now, the meat came from smaller creatures, hares, birds, fish drawn from under ice. They cooked carefully, savoring each bite, knowing the next would be harder to find. The children leaned close to the fire, eyes wide and shining, their faces painted in amber light. The elders spoke softly, not in words as we know them, but in tones shaped by rhythm and gesture. Meaning flowed not from sound but from presence. Outside, the storm roared across the mountains, a sound like the growl of the earth itself. Snow piled high against the cave entrance, sealing them in. But within, the fire continued to burn, its glow defying the cold that ruled the land. The Neanderthals had always lived between extremes, fire and frost, life and silence. Now, they faced the greatest of them all, time. Their world was ending, not in violence, but in stillness. The storms were not their enemy. They were the slow erasers of memory. As the night stretched on, they tended the flame with the same devotion their ancestors had shown for generations. Sparks rose and disappeared into the dark, like souls leaving the earth. The people sat close, sharing warmth and quiet understanding. That soon their kind would fade from the valleys forever. What they knew was simpler. That in this cave, beneath this roof of stone and smoke, they were together. and together they would face the long night. When the storm finally passed, the world outside lay buried under white silence. The wind had calmed, but it carried no promise of spring. In the cave, the embers glowed faintly before sinking into ash. The smoke drifted upward, curling against the rock before vanishing into darkness. It was the last breath of a people who had once ruled the cold, a quiet farewell carried by the wind. And though the fire died, its warmth lingered trapped in the stone, waiting for the day when another kind of human would find it and wonder who had once gathered here and how they had lived through the storm. The plain stretches beneath a sky of iron. Snow drifts across the open tundra, erasing the horizon, and in that endless white moves a shadow larger than life. The mammoth stands alone, its dark mass breaking through the veil of wind and cold. Its tusks, long and curved like ancient moons, glint with frost. Steam rises from its body, curling through the frozen air. It has survived 1,000 winters, but this one will be its last. Across the distance, a small band of hunters watches, silent and patient. They have followed this creature for days, through ice and exhaustion, knowing that its fall could feed their people for weeks or end them all in an instant. The mammoth is not prey in the modern sense. It is a moving fortress, a mountain of flesh and memory, older than the hunters who stalk it. To bring it down requires more than strength. It demands unity, planning, and courage born from desperation. The hunters move with purpose, spreading across the plain, their breath pluming in the cold. Flint-tipped spears gleam faintly in the pale light. The air is filled with the hum of tension, that quiet before the world erupts into movement. The first spear flies, it strikes deep, a wound that would fell a smaller animal but barely slows the giant. The mammoth trumpets, a sound that shakes the ground and echoes across the ice. It charges, fury and pain merging into one unstoppable force. The snow explodes beneath its weight. Another spear finds its mark, then another and another. The beast staggers but does not fall. It turns toward the hunters, and in that terrible moment, one of them is too slow. The mammoth's massive leg comes down, crushing bone and snow in a single deafening motion. The earth seems to shudder. Then, after one last bellow, the creature collapses, its great body sinking into the frozen plain. The sound fades, replaced by the whine of the wind and the harsh rhythm of breath. The silence that follows is heavy. The hunters stand still, their triumph tempered by loss. The fallen member of their group lies motionless beside the beast, the two forms human and mammoth entwined in death. The others gather around, not in celebration but in reverence. They have won food, warmth, and survival, but at a price written into the fabric of existence. Every victory in this world is a trade, every feast a reminder of mortality. The butchering begins as the light fades. Knives of flint open the thick hide, releasing heat and steam that rise like ghosts. The air smells of blood and life. The earth stained red against the white. Every piece is taken, the meat for nourishment, the hide for shelter, the bones for tools and art. Nothing is wasted. Even in grief, practicality endures. The hunters work with the same hands that will later bury their dead. The cycle of taking and giving continues, unbroken. When night falls, they light their fires beside the carcass. The flames dance against the mammoth's tusks, reflecting the story of their triumph and sorrow. The surviving hunters eat in silence, their faces glowing in the firelight, the weight of the moment etched into their expressions. They have fed their people, but they have also buried a piece of themselves in the snow. In the morning, only the bones remain, tall and pale against the frozen plain. The wind moves through them like a song, low, mournful, eternal. The mammoth's fall becomes part of the landscape, part of the memory of the Neanderthals who lived and died within this cycle of hunger and gratitude. And though both hunter and hunted will one day disappear, the story of that moment, the fire, the cold, the shared cost of survival will live on in the stones and the silence of the earth. There are moments in the history of the earth when the world itself seems to hold its breath. When the sky darkens not from storm or night, but from something deeper, something that changes the rhythm of time. For the Neanderthals, this was one such moment. Across their frozen world, the light began to fade. The sun, once a pale but constant companion, grew distant, shrouded by a veil of drifting ash. The air filled with dust that dimmed the horizon and turned the snow gray. The falling sky had begun. Far to the south, a great volcano had torn itself open, spilling fire into the heavens. For weeks, the eruption sent plumes of ash high into the atmosphere, where winds carried them across continents. The Neanderthals did not know the source of the shadow that crept over their land. They only knew its consequence. The days grew darker, colder, and quieter. The warmth that once lingered even in the depth of winter vanished, and the wind took on a new voice, a constant whisper of ice. The ash fell softly at first, like gray snow. It coated the trees and the bones of the plains, clinging to the fur of animals, collecting in the folds of skin and hide. It filled the air they breathed and the water they drank. The familiar world of light and reflection faded, replaced by a twilight that never lifted. Fire became their only source of brightness, and even its glow seemed weaker, smothered by the haze. Plants withered beneath the settling dust. Berries shriveled on the vine. Grass turned brittle, and the herds moved farther away, seeking cleaner air and open ground. The Neanderthals followed as they always had, but now their trails led them into silence. The land itself was starving. Every breath of wind carried the sting of ash. Every pool of water reflected a gray sky. For a people who had mastered the balance between earth and cold, this new darkness was unlike anything before. It was not the steady rhythm of ice advancing and retreating, it was something unpredictable, a wound in the sky. The air tasted of stone, and even sound seemed muffled, as if the world were listening to its own ending. Time no longer flowed in days and seasons, but in moments of endurance. One fire kept alive, one meal scavenged, one night survived. The youngest grew thin, their faces pale beneath the film of dust. The old moved slower, their strength slipping away. The earth had become heavy with silence. Even the animals seemed subdued, their calls distant and uncertain. The great mammoths moved like shadows through the haze, and birds fell from the sky, their wings coated with ash. Yet amid this darkness, the Neanderthals endured. They gathered close around their fires, building shelters against the falling sky. Their world had grown small, the circle of flame, the glow of eyes, the rhythm of breath, but in that smallness, life continued. Each spark struck against flint was an act of defiance, a reminder that they still belonged to the earth even as it seemed to turn against them. The ash would one day settle, pressed into layers of soil that scientists millennia later would read like a book. But for those who lived through it, it was not history. It was the long moment when time itself slowed, when the sun disappeared, and when humanity's will to endure was tested against the weight of the sky. And though the warmth never truly returned for them, the fire within the instinct to survive did not fade. In the quiet aftermath of the falling sky, their light still burned, fragile but unbroken, beneath the endless gray of a wounded world. The valley below lies frozen, locked in a silence that has no end. The wind no longer howls, it whispers. Snow has filled every hollow, buried every trail, and sealed the entrances of caves where life once flickered against the cold. In one of these caves, perched above the pale sweep of the earth, a single fire still burns. It is small now, a trembling circle of light in a world that has forgotten warmth. Around it, the last of the Neanderthals sleep, their bodies curled close, their breath faint in the cold air. The fire crackles softly, feeding on the final scraps of wood gathered from a dying forest. Its smoke rises weakly, curling toward the ceiling like a prayer. The walls around it are painted with the echoes of memory shapes of mammoth, deer, and handprints pressed into soot and pigment. These are not decorations. They are messages to the earth, traces of life inscribed against the coming darkness. The air carries the scent of ash, meat long gone, and the faint tang of stone. The cave is both home and tomb, both cradle and farewell. For countless generations, the Neanderthals have kept fires like this alive. They carried sparks from camp to camp, through storms, migrations, and the long march of the Ice Age. Fire was their inheritance, their companion, the fragile boundary between life and the vast, indifferent cold. But this fire is different. It is the last. Outside, no other smoke rises. No other hearth glows against the night. The man who tends it moves slowly, his breath visible in the dim light. His body carries the marks of endurance: broad chest, thick arms, hands calloused from a lifetime of work. His face is lined with the history of hunger and care. Around him lie the forms of those he guarded, their stillness deeper than sleep. The warmth that once bound them as family is slipping away, absorbed by the endless chill pressing in from the world beyond the stone. The last fire is a fragile thing. Its light flickers against the walls like heartbeat and memory combined. It casts moving shadows that seem to breathe, as though the past itself is alive within the flame. The man watches it with the quiet reverence of one who understands that when it dies, something greater than his people will be lost. For the fire is more than light. It is the record of their existence, the proof that they lived, that they thought, that they dreamed. Outside, the snow falls without sound. The world has grown still, waiting for the last glow to fade. When the final ember breaks apart, the cave will go dark forever. Yet in that moment, something endures. The soot on the walls, the shape of a hand pressed in ochre, the bones arranged near the hearth all remain as witnesses. The earth has a way of remembering what life refuses to forget. When dawn comes, there will be no movement in the valley, no footprints leading away from the cave. But beneath the frozen surface, warmth lingers faintly, trapped in the ashes and in the stone itself. It is not enough to rekindle the fire, but it is enough to be found one day, long after the cold has passed. And when that happens, when new eyes see the marks on the wall and touch the burned stones, they will know that once, in a world of endless winter, a people kept their promise to the light. The fire dies, but its story does not. It continues through the soil, through the bones of the living, through the memory of what it means to endure. The last flame fades into smoke, and the smoke becomes the breath of the earth, a whisper that will echo through time, carrying the simple truth the Neanderthals left behind, that even in the coldest darkness, the human spirit burns. The snow came quietly, as it always did. It began as a whisper across the plains, then thickened into a curtain that erased the horizon. By morning, the valley was gone, buried beneath a sheet of white that stretched farther than the eye could follow. The caves where fire once burned, the paths worn by countless migrations, the prints of bare feet and frozen mud all disappeared beneath the stillness. The Neanderthals were gone. There was no final cry, no violent end, no single moment when one could say they ceased to be. Their passing was slower, more sorrowful, more complete. It was the fading of a breath rather than the breaking of it. The last of their kind simply did not return to the places that once defined them. The tools they shaped from stone lay scattered across the earth, half buried, waiting. The bones of animals they hunted rested beside them, frozen in eternal repose. What had once been a camp, a living rhythm of firelight, laughter, and labor, became a field of silence. The earth absorbed them gently. Over time, the wind swept across their shelters, filling the hollows with dust and snow. Caves that once echoed with the crackle of fire became cold chambers of stone and memory. Spears and blades dulled under frost. The silence deepened, and in that silence, the story of an entire species was folded into the soil. Nature moved on with indifference. Ice advanced across the land, grinding mountains into plains, crushing forests beneath its weight. Rivers shifted course, carving new paths through valleys that once held life. Seasons lost their balance, the sun weaker, the air thin. The world that had shaped the Neanderthals erased its own architects, not through cruelty, but through time. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had endured the cold, adapted to every hardship, but in the end, endurance was not enough. The climate changed faster than their strength could follow, and their world slipped quietly beyond reach. The silence left behind was immense. The absence of their presence carried a weight heavier than any sound. No smoke rose from their hearths. No hands shaped stone or bone. The birds still called in spring, the wolves still howled at night, but nothing human answered. The wind became their only witness, moving endlessly over the snow, whispering through the hollows of their abandoned shelters. Yet, even in disappearance, they were not truly lost. The earth, in its slow patience, preserved what it could: the curve of a rib, the polish on a flint blade, the faint stain of ochre on limestone. These were the traces that would one day speak again. Buried beneath layers of ice and time, their story waited to be uncovered. The silence of the earth is not emptiness. It is remembrance. Every gust of wind that moves through the valleys carries fragments of their world. Ashes turned to soil, breath turned to air. The Neanderthals did not vanish. They became part of the landscape they once tamed. Their memory lingers in the bones of mountains and the hum of rivers, in the very rhythm of life that followed them. And so, the snow covers their camp one last time. The tools remain where they fell. The fire is cold, the shadows long. But the earth remembers, quietly and completely. The wind that passes over the frozen plains still carries their story, not as words, but as a feeling, a pulse of life that once was and, in some deep, unbroken way, still is. The story of the Neanderthals did not end in fire or battle, nor in a single moment of extinction. It ended in the quiet permanence of stone. Across the caves and cliffs of the Old World, their final voices still remain pressed, not in words, but in touch. A handprint, small and rough-edged, lingers on a wall of limestone deep beneath the earth. The fingers spread outward like rays of a forgotten sun, dusted in ochre, fixed in place by time. That mark, made tens of thousands of years ago, endures as the oldest human gesture of remembrance. It is both an introduction and a farewell, the silent bridge between their world and ours. The earth has kept their memory, in caverns untouched by daylight. The air still carries the faint scent of minerals and age. The walls bear the story of hands that once reached outward in wonder. Those prints were not idle decoration, they were declarations. The act of placing a hand upon the rock was an affirmation of existence, a way of saying, "I was here. I saw." The pigment that formed the image was drawn from the land itself, crushed stone mixed with water and breath. The hand and the earth were joined, each shaping the other. Over time, the world above changed. Ice retreated, forests grew where glaciers once stood, rivers carved new paths through the soil. The people who made those handprints were gone, but their mark endured, sheltered in darkness. The rock became their witness, their vault of memory. Each print, each faint line, held the warmth of a touch that had outlasted the body. In that endurance lies the truest form of immortality. To study these ancient traces is to glimpse the mind behind the hand. The placement of pigment, the deliberate spacing of fingers, the repetition across walls all reveal intention. These were not random acts of instinct. They were art, identity, and legacy. The same impulse that drives humans today to write, build, and remember once guided a Neanderthal to press pigment onto stone. It was the first attempt to outlive death. The limestone walls became a museum of their thoughts. Alongside the handprints are animal forms etched into shadow: bison, horses, and mammoth, carved in simple lines yet filled with life. These were not mere depictions, but acts of understanding, of reverence for the creatures that shared their world. In the glow of their fires, the walls moved as the flames flickered, giving motion to the figures. It was as if they had found a way to bring memory itself to life. And so the Neanderthals, though gone from the living earth, continued to speak through the stone. Their hands reached across time, touching the present through the medium of permanence. The earth became their language, their final diary. When archaeologists uncover those ancient impressions, they are not just finding art, they are meeting eyes that have long since closed, hearing the heartbeat of a people who refused to vanish completely. The handprint in the limestone stands as a testament to what it means to be human, to create in the face of oblivion, to leave a trace when all else fades. It is the simplest of symbols, yet the most profound, a single gesture bridging the gap between life and eternity. The earth holds it carefully, deep within its dark corridors, protecting it from wind and time. And though the Neanderthals are gone, their presence lingers in every shadowed curve of that stone. The rock remembers their touch, and in doing so, reminds us that the need to be remembered to be seen and known is older than history itself. Long after the last fire burned out, it was the hand upon the wall that carried their light forward, glowing softly in the darkness of the ages. The world did not end with them, it changed. The ice that had ruled for ages began to withdraw, inch by inch, melting back into rivers and seas. Valleys that once echoed with the heavy footsteps of mammoth and man grew green again. Forests rose where there had been only tundra, and new voices filled the air. The calls of birds returning, the rush of water freed from its frozen chains. The earth was waking. And though the Neanderthals were gone, their breath still lingered in the silence that followed, woven into the rhythm of life itself. Time, patient and unhurried, began to bury their world beneath layers of soil and memory. The caves that once glowed with fire faded into darkness, their tools dulled and turned to dust. The bones of their bodies settled into the earth, carried away grain by grain. Yet the story of their existence did not disappear. It endured in the most unexpected of places, in the shared pulse of humanity. Every heartbeat, every flicker of empathy, every fire lit against the dark still carries something of them. The retreat of the ice marked the beginning of a new chapter in the planet's long history. Another kind of human, Homo sapiens, spread across the same landscapes, following many of the same paths. They too built shelters, tamed fire, carved symbols into stone. The world they inherited was one the Neanderthals had shaped before them, their lessons embedded in the bones of the earth. The endurance of the Neanderthals was not erased, it was absorbed. To this day, their legacy survives not only in traces of bone or pigment, but in the essence of what it means to be human. The capacity to care for one another, to imagine, to create, to leave behind a mark, all were present long before history began. The Neanderthals lived these truths in their own quiet way, through the tenderness of a hand guiding another, through the soft murmur of comfort beside the dying fire, through the simple act of surviving together in a world that gave nothing freely. When we look into the flicker of a campfire, or trace our fingers across the walls of ancient stone, we touch the same longing that once stirred within them, the desire to endure, to be remembered, to belong to something greater than ourselves. The fires that burn today are not separate from theirs. They are continuations of the same flame, carried forward through unbroken generations of light. The world has moved on. The glaciers are gone, the valleys transformed, but the echo of their presence remains a whisper in the DNA of the living, a ghost in the warmth of every fire, a faint breath in the story of humankind. They are gone, yet they never truly left. Somewhere deep in a cave, hidden beneath layers of rock and silence, a handprint still waits in the dark. It is the same color as blood and earth, the same shape as our own. When light touches it again, it glows faintly, like an ember remembering the fire that once was. And in that glow, the Neanderthals live on not as fossils or relics, but as the first dreamers of humanity. The dream that stayed,